Alright, so magandang araw sa inyong lahat and welcome sa isang recorded lecture natin on History 30193 or History of Africa. So para sa lekturang ito, we will have a discussion on uh, certain topics that would introduce us to the course. Yan. So ito yung ating outline for this lecture. Okay, so we will begin with Africa as a continent. So we'll define what is Africa. Be followed by a course outline, the African continent, overview of the continent, misconceptions about Africa, and finally Africa in global history. So take note that these lectures will be concise as these will be elaborated in your respective sync classes. So let us first define the continent that we know as Africa. No? So what is Africa? For years, for centuries, it has been labeled by many in different ways. No? It used to be called the Dark Continent, the Mother Continent, and the Unknown Continent. So may mga respective periods yung prevalence ng mga ganitong labels sa Africa, no? Ayan. So simulan natin sa the Unknown Continent. It was called the Unknown Continent especially by the Europeans, no? During the ancient, to the medieval times, as it was largely obscure for many of them, for the Europeans in particular, kasi they find Africa as a continent or a land, that is largely unexplored, at least according to their perspective. And so they have put that label, the Unknown Continent, to refer to how they find Africa intriguing and mysterious. Now, fast forward to the emergence of the age of imperialism and conquest. Africa has been eventually called the Dark Continent, for various reasons that aren't really flattering. Okay, first, it was called the Dark Continent primarily because of its image, to many Europeans, so dagdag doon dun sa obscurity na meron itong continent way back dahil nga they lack knowledge about what Africa is as a whole, they called it as such because of the exoticism na nangyari. It's parang they put Africa in a certain view that it's exquisite, it's exotic, but again, largely in a very bad light. Okay? So bahagi din po kasi ng ganitong perspective on Africa, yung colorism, yung racism na very prevalent and systematic na po, even early on. Pero in the modern times, or today's time, Africa is mostly referred to as the mother continent, and generally maganda yung pagtawag na mother continent sa Africa because of the recent scientific findings that probably the first humans, specifically the Homo sapiens, only have emerged from the Africa. Alternatively, that is what we know as the out of Africa theory, ng peopling of the world. Yeah. So altogether, these views of Africa, itong mga samot-saring labels na to, can all be traced back to their respective context, And again, much of it has been a product, of the European lack of awareness, to what really Africa was about, no? At na-perpetuate na yung ganong image even up to this very day. So, now, let's begin discussing the first module titled The African Continent. Okay? So here, we'll talk about the outline of the course or the overview of the course para lang maging aware tayo what to expect in the series of discussions that we're going to have. So ayan, what we're doing right now is introducing Africa as a continent, no, dito sa ating discussion, which will be followed by the geography of Africa. This will be on a different lecture na, no? Video recorded lecture as well. You have ancient Africa, the chronology of ancient Egypt, and ancient Africa naman sa Nubian Empire. No? We'll also have Africa in the 19th century, particularly the European colonization, with a highlight on the African slave trade, no? Which will be followed by the post-colonial and contemporary Africa. And finally, the impact of colonization, Africa today. So, will also include the reinvention of Africa. So let's start with the discussion on the African continent. So the African continent covers around 1/5 of the total land surface of the Earth, and Africa is considered the second largest continent, just next to Asia. Okay, most of its boundaries are bodies of water, no? So in the west, you have the Atlantic Ocean, you have the Mediterranean Sea at the north, no, which separates it from Europe. Red Sea, sa east, no? And you have Atlantic and Indian Ocean sa southern part niya, no? And uh, one interesting thing about Africa is it's a continent that is also close, no, to the southernmost continent, which is Antarctica. Okay, so basically you have the tail of the continent, just sticking right next to the Antarctican continent. So the continent is composed of 56 sovereign states. Ayan, so 54 sa states na to recognized ng UN, no? Then 55 naman yung members ng African Union. So there is one more sovereign state na hindi pa kasali sa UN pero kasali na sa African Union. And the challenge to you is to find out what or which state is that or which country is that. Then there are a total of 10 territories in the continent. Territories are extraterritorial land, no, owned by countries that are not in Africa. So ito yung mga tinatawag nating enclaves na halimbawa sa Morocco, may islands doon na technically nasa African continent na siya, pero ang government ay it's under Spain, no? In the same manner, meron din ng Britain, ang France, no, na mga territories in the African continent, but mostly located na sa bodies of water. Then merong nag-iisang dependent. Okay? Now, before we jump to the full-blown discussion of Africa as a continent, it's very important to begin by discussing the misconceptions, no, about the continent. Okay? You know, let's all admit, no, na at some point in our lives we had this very twisted notion of what Africa is. Okay? At ginawa kong listahan ng mga yon at nandito siya ngayon sa slide, so babanggitin natin isa-isa. Yeah, number one misconception is that Africa is a country. So you rarely hear people refer to other continents as countries, no? But when we talk about Africa, it's like we're talking about a country. One time na I made a joke, no, way back in high school. I just randomly asked my classmates, what is the capital of Africa? And sadly, there are some of my classmates who took time to think of the capital, no? And hindi immediately nilang sinabi na, no, Africa is a continent. So, well, may namang mga nakasagot na continent ang Africa, but mas marami yung nag-isip muna talaga ng capital. At meron talagang nanghula pa. So, it's very unfortunate. Okay? Another misconception is Africa is entirely poor. So, may generalized view that Africa is impoverished. Okay, meron din tayong image that Africa is purely wildlife safari, no? So, when we talk about Africa, it's always giraffes and rhinoceros, but not buildings, institutions, no? And systems, ganyan. Africa is always hot. Another misconception. Africa is primitive. Africa has no industries. Africa is chaotic and unstable, and Africa is what? So we will address all of these misconceptions in this lecture. First misconception, or what we call the myth, no? It's defined it as a myth. Myth number 1, Africa is a country. No. Okay? So the very best way to test one's knowledge on geography is to immediately ask, do you know what's the capital of Africa? If they're really good at geography, they would immediately answer, no, Africa's a continent. Okay? So, as you can see here sa image, these are just the common misconceptions that people have for the continent. No? Ayan. So, na-reduce siya dun sa, sa ilang spots ng Africa. But, you really don't get the essence of understanding the entire continent. Second myth is that Africa is poor. Well, there is a considerable incidence of poverty among various African nations, but it is very reductive to say that the continent is poor just because of those cases. In fact, there are countries in Africa whose economy is way bigger than some Asian countries, overall. So, ayan. And Luanda in Angola is one of the most expensive cities, to live. So, indicator 'yon ng pag robust ng economic activity, no. All the more, no, in certain continents na in certain countries in the continent na okay naman ng economic performance, no. So again, it's not okay to reduce Africa as a poor continent just because of um, how it's portrayed in media. Myth number 3, Africa is wildlife safari. So here is an example of how uninformed, even well-known corporations like Delta Airlines sa US are or is when it comes to Africa. Okay? And so imagine, you have the silhouette of the Statue of Liberty to represent US, tapos sabi dito, ayan, no, Ghana, no, yung representation ng giraffe. And this tweet has been very much criticized by a lot of Ghanaians, no, kasi walang giraffe sa sa Ghana, no. It's in different country, no, mostly in Kenya. So, yan, sabi ng isang tweet pa dito, if we're gonna talk about something, at least take 10 seconds to study it a little. Delta, Africa is not a big bush full of wild animals. Okay, you have myth number 4 naman. Africa is always hot. No. So as you can see, the continent is big enough to be able to cover a lot of regions ng ating planet, no. So meron na sa equator, meron na sa Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, and in fact meron pang mga super cold regions sa continent, no. So to reduce again the continent as an entire chunk of a hot place, that would be a misconception. Myth number 5, Africa's primitive. That's a sad thing to say, because a lot of African cities are very much at par with what we consider modern. No? Okay, when you look at the capital cities of Ethiopia, Botswana, yan, Mauritius, uh, South Africa, no? uh, Nigeria, yan, Angola, those countries actually just have cities that are very much similar to other developing countries. So ayan, let's veer away from having that image of Africa na it's all agricultural, it's safari. No, it's not. Africa has no industries. Again, that's a wrong thing to say for myth number 6. While agriculture plays a huge role in the entire economy of the continent, ang dami pa din pong mga industries na kilala yung continent, like for mining, agribusiness, infrastructure, private sector, financial technology, and so on. No? So, even yung kanilang entertainment industry, no, it's doing relatively good, no? And in fact, just fun trivia to add, no, Africa is also known to consume Filipino entertainment materials a lot. Uh, madalas silang suki ng mga Filipino teleserye, no? Particularly those that come from ABS-CBN. So, if you'd happen to search about it, no, there was a time na yung teleserye ni Christine Hermosa and Jericho Rosales, no, titled Pangako Sa'yo, yung ni-remake ni Daniel and Catherine, that was shown in a lot of African countries. And there was even an instance that in a village in Kenya, I think it's in Kenya, a lot of mothers named their babies Angelo, no, just after the character of Jericho Rosales. So imagine how they see us Filipinos. So very a very unlikely occurrence, but hey, it's happening much as we consume Korean drama here in the Philippines. Myth number 7, Africa is chaotic and unstable. You're wrong, no? While certain African countries are very much known for incidences of violence, of crime, no, and political instability, may mga bansa pang outside the continent na mas malala pa yung situation, no? And when you look at this map from Statista, no, ayan, maraming nasa middle sa Africa, no? And mga countries din na very peaceful, contrary to how the world sees the continent as largely chaotic and unstable. Okay? And finally, you have myth 8, Africa is small. The Mercator projection is a very controversial way of mapping, and isa sa mga naging consequences ng Mercator projection of maps, no, ay yung pag-shrink ng size ng Africa compared to other continents. And there is politics behind the projection, mapping, how countries are portrayed in globes and maps. It just adds to the existing dynamics of our global society when it comes to how we view certain countries. Pero in reality, if we just stop relying much on the Mercator projection and talagang kinumpare natin yung size, no, yung land area ng mga continent versus Africa, you can see that you can fit Russia in there, no? May onting aawas lang sa Mediterranean. You can fit the entire US plus Alaska, no? And Hawaii, of course. You can fit the entire country of China. You can fit entire Brazil. You can fit almost the entire continent of Europe as well, and even India. So, with this graphics alone, na dapat ma-remove na yung idea that Africa is smaller than other continents because it's not. In fact, you can fit big, huge countries inside of it, in terms of land area. So after this, I want you to also think of the other misconceptions that you may think of, whenever you would um, think of Africa. Yung mga hindi natin nabanggit. And it will be very nice to be mentioned in your respective same class. No? But here's the biggest blunder. Africa had no prior history. This is utterly false. No? The idea that Africa did not have a history prior to the slave trade is actually one of the justifications made by the Europeans to actually validate the the human trafficking of Africans and selling them to the US to the Americans and to other parts of the Caribbean. And much of this idea that Africa had no prior history, that it's obscure, it originated a century decades before the actual start of the slave trade. No? And slave trade kasi is heavily characterized by racist persecution, colonial discourse, and they all use this to justify that Africans having no prior history, they all deserve to be treated that way because after all they come from an obscure background, again, which is false. And unfortunately, one of the known thinkers of Europe, Hegel, is also among those who have contributed to this notion about Africa. Quoting him, he said, Africa had no history prior to European contact. So parang without Europe, Africa would have been remainingly obscure pa din until that very day. So they didn't have the chance to develop on their own. That's why they should get the help of Europeans because they are not proper humans. And that's just a very distasteful way of justifying colonialism. Okay? But when you trace back the Greco-Egyptian interactions at the height of the existence of the Greek civilization, and how it coincided with the existence of other ancient societies in northern Africa, specifically ancient Egypt, there's a different story. Okay? The ancient Greeks, okay, yung pinnacle ng civilization ng Europe, acknowledge the glory of the African continent by keeping stable relations with the Egyptians. And they all know that the ancient Egyptian society has greatly much contributed to the Greek Hellenic culture, So basically, this has been set aside by those who justify the slave trade, the colonization of Africa. And yung narrative ay tinitwist nila to emphasize that colonialism will introduce order and stability to barbarians. Okay? And by barbarians, they refer to Africans. And dagdag pa dito, of course, 20th and 21st century na further na enhance yung decolonization or post-colonial discourse, at dito natin na ungkat kung ano nga ba yung napakabigat na role ng Africa sa napakaraming aspekto ng ating mundo today. So, Africa has this very undeniable role in evolution and migration of early humans. Africa is also a cradle for the first settlements and ancient civilizations. And definitely, Africa is also involved. Africans has already been in contact with Europeans and Asians way before um, the existence of a very modern Europe. So again, when you put this all together, it would just totally crush that very colonial discourse that Africa was nothing before European contact. And this juncture, I want you to think of other significant things Africa might be known for concerning prehistory and ancient history. Yun lamang. I hope you learned something and thank you for listening.